As the Cultural Revolution expanded to include everyone in China, there was rivalries that developed and really infighting amongst the insiders of the revolution to determine who was more pure. Initially, people who had good class backgrounds were seen as more pure, and that gave them the leg up in the battle for the hearts and minds of the Cultural Revolution. But this could turn at any moment. In October of 1966, the party put out an editorial that said, quote, "The power holders inside the ranks of the party who take the capitalist road are a small bunch of counter-revolutionary revisionists. They raise the red flag in order to fight the red flag. They are like Khrushchev. At the first opportunity, they will plot to usurp the party, the army, and the state. They are our most dangerous and principal enemies." End quote. Now, up to this point, people who were from a good family background were called Reds. People who had bad class backgrounds were known as Blacks, and people who had kind of neutral backgrounds were Grays. So what Mao seemed to be doing with this dictate from the party was giving those Blacks, the people with bad class backgrounds, a chance to rebel against the Reds, who were basically the party establishment. What Mao is really doing here is he's taking advantage of the biting resentment that people had in their local communes or their local work units or their local factories or against their local cadres, and it's all based on the memory of the Great Leap Forward. All the death and turmoil that was a result of that Great Leap Forward, people still had bitter memories of that, and they were finally able to direct some of that animosity and some of that hatred towards the people that they saw as the enemies, which were the local party establishments. So you start seeing these factions start developing where you have what's known as rebels who are often fighting against that party establishment, and royalists who are more about class background and kind of the origins of the Cultural Revolution, not necessarily wanting to fight back against the party establishment. Both sides would be hurling incendiary labels at each other, stuff like, quote, anti-party elements, rightists, pseudo-revolutionaries, pseudo-leftist but genuine rightists, end quote. And it's just interesting to pay attention to the labels here because all of those nonsensical labels sound a little bit similar to the generic, nonsensical, and lack of nuance conversation that you see on Twitter or on cable news today. At a certain point here, at various times in different regions across China from 1966 to 1967, many historians think that what you really have here was a civil war. You had a party establishment that was seen as doing well, and then you had an underbelly of society that was bitterly angry and had simmering resentment and anger and disgust as a result of some of the failed policies of the Communist Party. As the Cultural Revolution started as that campaign against people with bad class backgrounds, these counter-revolutions would often bubble up where people were so disgusted at the party and some of the things they were doing, they saw this as an opportunity to rebel. And it seemed like Mao Zedong was giving these people finally the opportunity to rebel. He was giving the power back to the masses, and he was feeding this frenzy of chaos. It wasn't just a bitter culture war between these factions, but it was sometimes literally pitched battles. Both sides were appealing to Mao and the party, saying that they were the true inheritors of the communist ideology, and Mao sat there and cheered it on. As he sat comfortably in his palace on his birthday in June, anticipating the future chaos, he said, quote, "To the unfolding of a nationwide civil war," end quote. Well, it turns out he got what he wanted, because by the end of 1966, it wasn't just the Red Guards participating in the Cultural Revolution anymore. Workers, farmers, factory workers and owners, peasants, were flooding the cities trying to seize power, violently if necessary, and you had the party establishment in many cases fighting back against them. The whole country was involved. Of course, Mao was cheering it on. He said in January of 1967, quote, "If you have power, you have everything. If you don't have power, you have nothing. Unite yourselves, form a great alliance, and seize power. Seize power. Seize power." End quote. It always comes back to power for Mao, and it seemed like that was always his endgame. But he never seemed to have a plan after that, because getting power is great, but it's what you do with it that ultimately defines you as a leader. As the chaos was unfolding into 1967, one group that was standing on the sidelines watching, for the most part, was the army. So the question boiling under the surface was, eventually, when the army gets involved, whose side are they going to take? Now, the head of the army, a guy by the name of Lin Biao, and many others in the upper ranks seemed to dislike the treatment of certain people in the party by these proletariat masses who Mao is encouraging to revolt against the party. Sometimes well-respected party leaders and people who had been part of the party for years were humiliated, beaten, falling victim to these counter-revolutions that popped up. Here's one person describing a situation like this where a well-respected party leader is being destroyed by these proletariat masses. Quote, "I watched with horror. Here was a man who had fought all of his life for the revolution, a man whom everyone in China knew, almost as a legend. If even he had no protection in this anarchy, then what of us ordinary people? I felt myself choking, and I wanted to cry." End quote. I think that gives you a little bit into what many people at the top of the army were feeling. They didn't like how these new rebels were destroying local party establishments. And as what was essentially this civil war was unfolding between these rebels and these masses and the party establishment, Mao eventually realized that the army was going to have to intervene to stop the chaos. So he allowed the army to intervene on behalf of the proletarian left. And I think he said that in order to make it seem as vague as possible, because he was a little bit worried whose side the army was going to take. And of course, the army by and large was incredibly suspicious of the masses, because many in the army had friends or family that were part of the party establishment that was being persecuted by these masses that are being encouraged by Mao. And so in 1967, the army took the opportunity to impose order. And they often intervened in these battles on the side of the party establishment. At times, they would declare martial law in certain cities. They would hunt down, quote-unquote, rebel elements. They would mow down protesters with machine guns. Whatever it took to establish order. Here's historian Frank Dikötter discussing how the army was getting involved in some of these skirmishes between the rebels and the royalists. Quote, "The worst confrontation took place in Qinghai, the barren province to the east of Xinjiang, dominated by steppe and desert. After weeks of skirmishes between rebels and royalists, the deputy commander of the military sent his troops on February 23rd to quell an organization that had seized control of the main newspaper. At first, all the loudspeakers attached to the office block housing the newspaper were shot down. A barrage of gunfire followed, killing all those who defended the entrance to the building. The army had prepared several flamethrowers, but these turned out to be unnecessary, as the rebels were unarmed. All resistance crumbled. The army took less than 20 minutes to storm the premises. More than 100 people were killed in the assault, including a 17-year-old girl crying by the side of her injured father. The bodies were hastily buried in a mass grave. When the deputy commander telegraphed his report in Beijing, the marshal complimented him. Lin Biao and Mao Zedong, eager to protect the army, did not intervene. In the following week, some 10,000 people were arrested, many of them tried as counter-revolutionaries and sent off to the Gulag." End quote. Stuff like this is going on all over the country, and it can easily be interpreted as the Army's general distaste for the Cultural Revolution. Mao realized this, of course, and acted quickly to befriend Lin Biao, the head of the army, and Zhou Enlai, who were both important people behind the scenes of the party, and this was helpful for him to get the support of the army. So just if you're keeping score at home here, it seems like the tide is shifting back again. So the Cultural Revolution started as people persecuting those who they saw as bad class elements, people who came from the wrong class. Then there was sort of a counter-revolution where the party was deciding who the bad class elements were and kind of suppressing those who were originally criticizing the party. Then Mao, of course, threw his weight behind the masses, and you had a counter-revolution, which was led by the masses against those work teams and against the party who was trying to suppress some of these dissenters. And then once that spiraled out of control, you now have a counter-revolution led by the army against people who are criticizing the party establishment too much. If you're feeling confused, so am I. At any rate, during the first few months at the beginning of 1967, it looks like it's going to be a period of relative calm. The army seems to have taken control of the country. The workers are back at work. The Red Guards are back in school in many places, even though this was difficult to accomplish because many schools were physically destroyed and many teachers were killed or physically and emotionally unable to do their jobs, obviously. But really sadly for everyone involved here, Mao was never satisfied with this. And it seems like he waited a few months to solidify his position and get the army on his side a little bit before he issued one of his next orders. Once his position was solidified with the army and he didn't have to worry about them taking control of him, he issued an order on April 6th, which basically prevented the army from firing on protesters, firing on rebels, disbanding any of these rebel organizations, or doing anything to stop them when they invaded some of these areas. And of course, many ordinary people who had just been humiliated or spent months in jail at the hands of the army or had their stuff destroyed during this latest shift in the revolution, or maybe they had family and friends where horrible things happened to them, they, of course, were itching for revenge. And all of a sudden, the wheel turns again, the cycle continues, and the Cultural Revolution takes another shift, and here we go again. As if we needed another wrinkle to the Cultural Revolution, now it's not just about bad class versus good class, or teacher versus student, or party establishment versus revolutionary masses. Now we have another element of it, which is pro-army or anti-army, and another contentious group of people that can disagree and fight it out. By the summer of 1967, what historian Frank Dikötter calls the blood debt is raging. Battles, violence, riots, you name it, and the cycle of violence is continuing. Here's Dikötter describing it, quote, "No one wanted to give up. Those on both sides were fueled by mutual hatred, but also by the belief that they, rather than the opposition, were faithful followers of the chairman. Most of all, the rebels and the royalists were fighting for their own political survival. They were defending their past choices. Many of the students, workers, and cadres involved in the Cultural Revolution had been forced to make rapid choices in extraordinarily confused circumstances. The situation changed constantly, with bewildering reversals in fortune dictated by the whimsical policies emanating from Beijing. People drifted towards different sides of the divide, ending up fighting their own friends, colleagues, and even family members. And all of them realized that if they were exposed, the victors would brand them as rightists or counter-revolutionaries. At best, they would be driven out of their work units and lose all their benefits, forced to eke out an existence on the margins of society. At worst, they would be sent to the Gulag. They were fighting for their own survival. As one historian of the Red Guards has observed, they were trapped in a cycle of violence and the prospect of losing had become unthinkable." End quote. At this point in the Cultural Revolution, no one was immune to factionalism. And whether covertly or overtly, some people were supporting Mao, or supporting the army, or supporting the revolutionaries, or supporting the proletarian left, or supporting the party establishment. And it seems like this was the opportunity for hundreds, thousands of people to take the opportunity to right personal wrongs and correct personal vendettas from years or even decades ago. All the way from the top of the party food chain with people like Lin Bao and Zhou Enlai sponsoring factions that would be involved in the deaths of thousands of people, all the way down to the local everyday level, where Red Guards or workers or farmers would take the opportunity to accuse someone or expose someone who had previously wronged them. As historian Frank Dikötter said in his book, The Cultural Revolution, A People's History, in a one-party state, personal relations were far more important than ideology. He goes on to say that in the chaos of 1967, many people felt the need to arm themselves because of all the craziness. Quote, "The guns distributed by the 47th Army no longer sufficed. They stole from the local militias, broke into arsenals, and attacked military bases. They had grenades, bayonets, machine guns, cannon, and anti-aircraft missiles. In the stifling summer heat, bullets whistled past in the streets, sirens wailed in the distance, and lorries sped by. A curfew was imposed, but even in the daytime, ordinary people out to buy food risked being hit by stray bullets if they went too close to some of the strategic buildings guarded by armed fighters. People crisscrossed their windows with tape to prevent their shattering as the city shook with explosions and gunfire. Mortars were fired by inexperienced rebels. Some of the shells went astray, exploding on roofs, landing on the road, or smashing into buildings. The night sky flashed. In daytime, it glowed orange." End quote. It's hard to overstate the chaos that was going on in China during the summer of 1967. In July and August, a couple of incidents thrust the Cultural Revolution into the global consciousness. What you had was in British-controlled Hong Kong, there were all sorts of riots and turmoil. Bombs, riots, people critical of the Cultural Revolution and the Communist Party were being beaten up, destroyed, buried alive. And, of course, there was retaliation from the government in Hong Kong. Bottom line, you had dozens of people dying in violence, but overall, many of the people in Hong Kong were actually refugees from China, and they knew what was going on with the CCP and Mao Zedong, and they weren't buying what the protesters were selling. Another big event was there was a small faction in the Cultural Revolution that sets the British mission in Beijing on fire. And I don't believe anyone died in this incident, but obviously anytime a foreign embassy or anything like that is destroyed, that's going to be a big international incident. And even Mao Zedong had to order some of these revolutionaries to back off. And he ended up punishing those responsible for the fire. So with these international incidents and the chaos in China totally ramping up to unprecedented levels, Mao now had to turn the wheel again, and he had to attempt to calm things down. He gave the army support and more authority to crush the rebels, something he took away from them just months before. And all of a sudden, you have a fresh round of violence where tens of thousands of people are being killed because the army is crushing all of these resentments and these revolts that are breaking out from the revolutionary masses that Mao had previously encouraged. Implicitly and explicitly, people were encouraged to go back to their normal lives by the end of 1967, and many people in China were actually weary and they were tired of what was going on with the Cultural Revolution. They wanted to resume a normal everyday life. Many people were bored or just scared of politics because, You never knew when that wheel was going to turn, the revolution was going to change, and you were going to become the target. But sadly, many people had nothing to go back to. Their homes were destroyed, their possessions and what they cherished most was gone, their family or friends were killed. There was no theater or movies or games or parks or clubs. Everything was controlled by the party. Many people ended up just playing cards, traveling into nature, joining gangs, trying to do anything that was not the Cultural Revolution. Many went to study classes, trying to be remolded into the Mao Zedong thought paradigm. As we talked about in the previous episode, Mao was the only thing that people could unite on without fear of being destroyed. By the time 1968 rolls around, you have a period of relative calm and a renewed round of Mao worship. Again, the only safe thing in this climate was to revere and worship Mao. One office worker said, quote, "Every morning we would stand in front of this with our little red book and read aloud a few passages. Then, waving the little red book, we would say 3 times, 'Great leader, teacher, helmsman, Chairman Mao. May you live 10,000 years. And good health forever to Vice Chairman Lin Bao.' It struck me as absurd, almost like a religion. Many of us felt that way, as I was to discover after the Cultural Revolution. At the time, however, no one in their right mind would dare say it openly, let alone discuss it." End quote. People went back to work. Students studied their red books diligently, rather than diligently kidnapping or murdering people. Statues, monuments, and posters of Mao went up. But while this period of relative calm was going on, make no mistake, it was a relative calm. There were still roundups that were happening. There was still the army oppressing the rebel groups. There were still students revolting against teachers in certain areas of China. Horrible things were happening all over the country. During this time period, I read about a lot of disgusting things, and I think I'll spare you the details of this one in particular, but if you've ever read Game of Thrones and know about the Frey pie theory, let's just say there were meat casseroles that were being served up in China at this time period. Ultimately, amidst the smoldering ruin of China, Mao Zedong had no choice but to, quote-unquote, declare victory. He issued what was known as the July 3rd Directive in 1968, July 3rd, demanding an end to the violence, trying to get everybody to unite together as revolutionaries. He attempted to put an end to the Red Guards and their reign of terror. He was trying to calm down a China that was out of control. He said, quote, "Whoever still continues to rebel, attack the People's Liberation Army, sabotage transportation, kill people, or set fire to property is a criminal. If there is a small number of people who do not listen and refuse to reform, then they are bandits. They are nationalists. They are trying to encircle us. And if they persist, then we will have to exterminate them." End quote. In September, Zhou Enlai announced from Tiananmen Square that, quote, "Now the whole country is red. Now we can declare that through repeated struggles during the past 20 months, we have finally smashed the plot of the handful of top party persons in authority taking the capitalist road." End quote. So it seemed that Mao and Zhou Enlai and some of the people at the top of the party that had survived so far were declaring victory. Sadly, for the rest of China, this turned out to be yet another piece of propaganda, and it turned out that the Cultural Revolution was far from over.